Good afternoon. My name is Tom Nastic. I'm producer of public programs here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to welcome those of you who are here in the William G. McGowan Theater, as well as those watching us live on our National Archives YouTube channel. Today, our series of noontime author lectures continues with this book, Countdown to Pearl Harbor, The 12 Days to the Attack, with our special guest, Steve Toomey. This program is, of course, presented in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, which occurred on December 7, 1941. Before we get to today's program, I would like to tell you about two upcoming programs that will take place in this theater. This Thursday evening at 7 p.m., we will present a panel discussion, The 14th Amendment's Shield of National Protection, a Constitutional Guarantee of Liberty and Equality. Moderated by Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO, National Constitution Center, and Elizabeth Wydra, President, Constitutional Accountability Center. A distinguished panel will discuss how the 14th Amendment enshrined the promise of liberty and equality in our Constitution, and look at implications for today's most important issues, including racial discrimination, gun rights, marriage equality, economic liberty, and gender equality. Then on Wednesday, December 7th, our commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor continues, with a noon lecture by author Craig Nelson, who will speak on his book, Pearl Harbor: From Infamy to Greatness. Then at 2 p.m., we will present a selection of archival film, radio broadcasts, and images that illustrate how the media first informed and kept Americans apprised of the December 7, 1941 attack. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online at archives.gov. There are copies in the lobby, along with a sign-up sheet so you can receive it by regular mail or email. You'll also find brochures about other National Archives programs and activities. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially its education and outreach programs. Pick up your application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Steve Toomey began his career in journalism as a copyboy at the Chicago Tribune when he was in high school. After graduating from Northwestern University, he began a 14-year career at the Philadelphia Inquirer, during which he won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing and then worked at the Washington Post for the next 13 years. More recently, he has written for Smithsonian and other magazines and has taught narrative writing at the graduate schools of New York University and the City University of New York. After his talk and audience Q&A, Steve will be signing copies of his book, One Floor Up, outside the Archives store. Would you please welcome Steve Toomey to the National Archives?
Good afternoon. Certainly glad to be here. I want to thank the Archives for inviting me. I actually want to thank the Archives for existing. Without the Archives, without the materials I found at Archives 2 and at the Presidential Library in Hyde Park, this book would be a much poorer thing. And I was amazed by the extraordinary patience and knowledge of staff at both places. Frequently I thought, why don't they write a book? Because they know more than I do. I must confess, it occurred to me when I started this that Pearl Harbor was not exactly an unknown event. It's reasonable to ask whether the world was clamoring for another book about it, especially one by me, a journalist who had absolutely no experience, really, with writing about people who were, to put it bluntly, dead, and therefore would not be returning my calls and would not be agreeing to let me come to their offices and interview them. Almost all of us know that the attack plunged the country into the world war that was raging at that point. We also know who did it. I think I'm on safe ground. No one in here is going to be surprised by the discussion that follows when it refers to who did it. We also know, or I think we've heard, that Franklin Roosevelt had word that the Japanese were coming and let them. because he wanted to get us into the war. And I would like to interrupt my own remarks to say that the 75th anniversary is a terrific moment, the perfect moment to bury forever that conspiratorial fantasy that Franklin Roosevelt knew this was going to happen. He did not. And if we start discussing that, we will discuss nothing else, because there are a lot of arguments for why he didn't know. But you get the point. Pearl Harbor was and is not exactly an unplowed field. There was a 2005 Ben Affleck movie about it by that name, in fact. And you know, what's great about that movie is that it managed to unearth some crucial romantic angles that previous books and movies had failed to catch. So why another book? Well, in the summer of 2011, I did something that I presume some, if not many of you in here have done. I got aboard a Navy launch at the Visitor Center at Pearl Harbor and went out to the Arizona Memorial. The Arizona Memorial has been described as a squashed milk carton, which is actually pretty accurate. It's a very long, white, swooping structure that sits astride the remains of the battleship Arizona, one of 8 battleships that was in the harbor at that point, on that morning. And to go out there is like going to the battlefield at Gettysburg, if you've done that. As you look into the water of the harbor, at the rusting decks of the Arizona, which are lying right below the surface because the harbor is very shallow, and that actually was an important aspect of the attack. You are standing at one of the pivot points of history, a very warm and sunny place, but a very somber one, and it raises a lot of questions, at least it did for me. Not least, of course, being how. How did this happen? In that harbor took place the most catastrophically unexpected event in American history to that point, 165 years. It shattered the nation's sense of itself as a confident, safe, optimistic, superior country. And it shattered the Navy's reputation as competent and unbeatable. You have to remember, you have to know, the Navy was a bigger thing in 1941 than it is now. Newspapers routinely printed stories about people being promoted and changes of command in the Navy. And people were really aware of these giant battleships with their big guns, plying the oceans on either side of us and keeping us safe. Article after article proclaimed the Navy to be superior, best in the world. Let me share something that happened to convey how shocking it was that that Navy and that attack, that Navy could be surprised by that attack. This event happened on December 7th, but 5,000 miles away. In a private home outside New York City, there were a group of journalists and officials sitting down to a nice Sunday afternoon dinner, and the phone rang, and there was news. The news was that the Japanese had attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor. And one of the guests, he was described as perhaps the most savvy of the group there, the most knowledgeable about how the world worked, immediately told everyone at the dinner that this was a hoax. And they all agreed with that. I think if the term had been in common usage then, they would have all said they were being punked. It just was not something they could imagine. Fewer and fewer people today have a memory, a living memory of that shocking moment. We have only those vague general assumptions and associations that I mentioned. We know it started the war, we know who did it. But in reality, Pearl Harbor is a multi-act Shakespearean drama. And let me tell you about the man, one of the men involved, whose part in it really hooked me on the story. His name is Husband Kimmel. And on the morning of December 7th, he was supposed to go out and play golf. But about 8 a.m., a telephone call led him to leave his house. His house sat, still there, on a small rise above the harbor. It was actually an extinct volcanic rim. And he went out of his house because this phone call had told him, in effect, to do so, and stepped into his yard and looked down at the harbor beneath him. And as he did that, he was watching dozens and dozens of Japanese warplanes diving down, launching torpedoes, pouncing on those ships in the harbor. And those were his ships. He was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. And until that moment, he had enjoyed nearly 40 absolutely spotless years of service in the Navy, had succeeded at everything he had done and risen steadily through the ranks of the Navy. And if you ever see a picture of him, he looks exactly like you'd expect an admiral to look. He's handsome, impressive, confident. Standing with him in his yard was a neighbor, the wife of one of his officers who had come out of her home, also drawn by what was happening outside. And together they stood there watching the destruction, seeing the smoke rising over the harbor. The noise was terrific as bombs went off and ships began to shoot back. And they could see a battleship in the harbor already starting to tip over. And the neighbor remembered sort of that everything that Kimmel knew about military logic and tactics, everything he knew about the Japanese and their ability, was being blown up before his eyes. All the decisions he had made were being nullified. And the neighbor recalled him standing there, and she said that his face was as white as the uniform he wore. I think that's one of the most poignant moments in American history. Kimmel was standing there and realized not only was this horrific disaster happening, but it was going to be the end of his career, as it was. So yes, we may know the ending of Pearl Harbor, but we don't know the players. We don't know their decisions and their mistakes. We don't know the pain, not just in Hawaii, but in Washington, when they all realized they were so wrong about what was likely to happen. Kimmel and all the other men, and they were all men, I can't rewrite history to diversify the cast, all these men were trying in the late fall of 1941 to figure out what this odd, mysterious nation on the far side of the Pacific, a country they really, really did not understand. Kimmel had been there 2 or 3 times in his life, but he didn't know much about the Japanese, didn't speak Japanese. Almost no one in the Navy spoke Japanese. And so they were trying to figure out what this country was going to do. And I think we need to note 2 things in their defense as we discuss Pearl Harbor. This will seem really obvious, but we have to remember that they didn't know December 7th was a famous day. It hadn't happened yet. They had no awareness that along with July 4th or November 22nd, 1963, or September 11th, that was would be a famous date. It wasn't circled on their calendars. It's a pretty human thing to think that tomorrow is going to be like today, because it usually is. And so routine is a powerful force working against or on all of the people involved in Pearl Harbor. The second thing we need to remember is that this was the age before satellites. There were no cameras parked up there in the sky looking down, snapping photos, as there would be today, when 30 Japanese warships began silently sailing out of an absolutely obscure bay, cold, snowy, almost no people there, at the far northern fringe of the Japanese Empire. We did not know they had left because we had no means of knowing they had left. Still, during this period, clues were building that something big was going to happen. And so to me, to answer the question of why another book, these were the ingredients of a nonfiction thriller. It would begin on November 26th, 1941, which is the day those ships left that bay, and it would end, of course, on December 7th. And so for the remainder of the remarks, I'd like to share with you 4 points about those that arise sort of in those 12 days. And to do that, to make those points, I'd like to introduce you to 4 people. To tell you about the first, let me take you, the first of those people, let me take you to one of those 12 days. Today, in fact, November 30th, 1941, 75 years ago today. It was a Sunday. The United States had been at peace for 8,420 consecutive days since November 11th, 1918, the end of the Great War. On that Sunday, a woman named Helen Doth was a relatively new resident of the Hawaiian Islands. She had arrived a few weeks before after boarding an ocean liner on the West Coast with her 2 little kids. Now, it was possible to fly to Hawaii in 1941. It was quite an adventure. Pan Am's Clippers couldn't carry many people. They couldn't carry much in the way of luggage. You were droning through the air for like 15 hours or something. And maintenance and safety were not as good then as they are now. So most people took a passenger liner to Hawaii, and Helen and her 2 kids did. And it's a voyage of 2,000 miles that takes about a week. And when Helen arrived, she was overjoyed because her husband was based on Oahu. He was an Army officer, so they were being reunited. But she was also extremely grateful to have arrived alive. She had thought that en route there was a good chance the Japanese would torpedo her passenger liner, and she and her children would die. And when she got to Oahu, she wrote a letter back to some of her uncles in Kentucky. And she said, "We didn't get bombed or torpedoed as I had anticipated. In fact, we didn't even see a submarine or a Jap on the whole trip." And she went on to say, but she knew they were out there because those Japanese were really crafty. Now, that's more than a month before Pearl Harbor. This was early November, she wrote that letter. We tend to think of Pearl Harbor as this bolt from the blue, that the United States was minding its own business, and the Japanese came along and started World War II. But in fact, any American paying reasonable attention to the news, like Helen was and did, in 1941, knew that war with Japan was getting closer all the time, as well as war with Germany. Just as an aside, I don't think most people know that in the Atlantic Ocean, we were already fighting the Germans, even though we were technically at peace. We were escorting British convoys to England, and Roosevelt had given orders to shoot on sight any German ship they encountered en route. and the Germans were replying by shooting at our warships. They had sunk at least 2 with loss of life in the Atlantic. So people were really attuned to the idea that war was likely to happen, including war with Japan. The Roosevelt administration had been negotiating for months with the Japanese, to put it very simply, to get them to stop attacking countries in the Far East. The Japanese had been at war with China since 1937. They had taken over much of French Indochina in 1941, by 1941. And in late November and December of 1941, it was obvious from the reports of consular agents, businessmen, spies, commercial ships on the ocean, it was obvious that the Japanese were moving warships and troop transports toward the Southwest Pacific, toward Singapore, which was a British outpost and naval base, toward Malaya, towards the Dutch East Indies, towards Thailand, and towards the Philippines, which we owned. It was so, that movement of troops and warships was so obvious that on November 27th, Washington sent a warning about the possibility of war to all of its Army and Navy outposts in the Pacific. And that said that war was imminent in a matter of days. And Helen Doth probably noticed the effect of that warning as she went about her life on Oahu, because the Army was suddenly out on the streets of Honolulu. The Army was starting to guard bridges and commercial radio stations and telephone exchanges and waterworks, guarding against sabotage by some of the residents of Hawaii of Japanese descent. So on November 30th, she knew that. On November 30th, she knew there was something else that happened today that she could not have known of. It takes a second for me to explain this, and I hope you'll stay with me. It involves the major form of intelligence that the Navy was able to rely on in 1941. We listened to what the Japanese Navy was saying to itself. We could hear them talking ship to ship, ship to shore, shore to ship. And there were dozens of people whose job was to do that. You'd sit there all day with headphones on, listening to the Japanese talking to themselves. We didn't know what they were saying because they were speaking in a form of code. It wasn't that it was Japanese, it was coded Japanese. We didn't know what they were saying to each other, but it's remarkable how just by hearing who is talking to who, you can figure out who's in charge and who is moving where, and you might even be able to identify certain ships, simply because every ship had an address, a phone number, if you will. It's called a radio call signal. And so if you got enough of those assembled, if you knew who this guy was and who that guy was, you could figure out that something might be going on by how they were, the volume of talking, and who was in charge. End of dissertation about that. The Japanese knew we listened to them because they listened to us. And in order to confuse the other side, you routinely changed everybody's address so that we would have to relearn who this guy was and who that guy was. Hope I haven't lost you. The Japanese changed their radio call signals in a regular way, usually every 6 months. Every ship got a new name, a new radio call signal. And on November 1st, right on schedule, the Japanese Navy changed all of its radio call signals. Then on November 30th, something extraordinary happened. All the Navy listeners in Hawaii and also in the Philippines suddenly realized the Japanese had changed their radio call signals again, only a month after they had done it before. They had never done that. And that was read immediately as a desire by the Japanese to really confuse us about something they were about to do. That message, of course, reached Washington. In fact, because we're at the archives, a copy of it is at Archives 2, when the Office of Naval Intelligence informed the Navy Department that at precisely midnight they had changed all these call signals. It's an amazingly significant moment. So that was point number one I wanted to make to you with Helen and with that dissertation on what is called traffic analysis. And that is, war was extremely close and we knew it. And not only that, we knew that Pearl Harbor, we had discussed for months that Pearl Harbor might be the subject of a surprise attack before a declaration of war. And to understand that, I want to introduce you to the second person that I'd like you to meet today. His name is Patrick Bellinger. And Bellinger was designated as Naval Air Pilot number 4. As that suggests, he had been around at the birth of naval aviation back in the teens. Remember, we weren't flying airplanes until 1903 when Orville and Wilbur lifted off. Bellinger owned many firsts in naval aviation back from 1916 and 1917. He really knew flying. And in March of 1941, Bellinger had co-authored a report. And it's sort of like Michael J. Fox getting into the DeLorean and taking off for the future. Because Bellinger's report almost exactly forecast what subsequently happened. He said that when times are tense, diplomatic times are tense, and we're not getting along with Japan, and at this moment we're not getting along with Japan, it's possible the Japanese would attempt to move what he called a fast raiding force of one or more aircraft carriers, move them from Japan into Hawaiian waters. And they would be able to do that without our knowing that they had done it. And at about 300 miles away from Oahu, they would launch their planes. And those planes would arrive over Pearl Harbor, perhaps at dawn, and they would catch the fleet in the harbor. And if that happened, the results would be disastrous. He wrote that again in March of 1941. On November 30th, 75 years ago today, Bellinger had no knowledge of the war warnings that I had mentioned earlier because no one had told him. He knew that negotiations with the Japanese were going badly, but he didn't know they had reached such a tense point that official warnings had come from Washington. No one would tell him in the next few days either that the Navy listeners now couldn't find 4 of Japan's aircraft carriers. They had vanished from the radio waves. We, again, were still a little befuddled by this sudden, unexpected change in the radio call signs, but it seemed clear that we were comfortable saying we didn't know where the 4 were. No one told Bellinger that. So on November 30, the man who had forecast a raid under tense circumstances didn't know carriers were missing and didn't know they were that tense, the times were that tense. Which brings me to the third point, and the third person I'd like you to meet. His name is Arthur McCollum. Arthur was the chief of the Far Eastern section of Naval Intelligence, and he was a most unusual American because he had been born in Japan. His parents were missionaries. He spoke Japanese. He had served in Japan twice as a naval officer. He had even taught the emperor wasn't the emperor at that moment, McCollum had even taught the emperor how to dance American style. So the Japanese respected McCollum and he respected them. And that, however, was not the common opinion of most Americans in 1941. And that's point number 3, to go with person number 3. Americans tended to think of the Japanese as almost amusingly curious little people who were not particularly creative or innovative. Their weapons were thought to be not too good. Their ability with things mechanical was thought to be not too great. They were even thought to have physiological defects that made them lousy flyers. In 1939, an author by the name of Fletcher Pratt, a pretty well-known author, had written this: "The Japanese as a race have defects of the inner ear, just as they generally are myopic. And because they just put them in an airplane, they're going to crash." In August of 1941, The Nation magazine said that, quote, "In technical achievements, especially in aviation, the Japanese blue jackets, sailors, are not up to American standards." McCollum tried to convince people that, no, you've got it all wrong. They're actually quite good at what they do. But he later said it was impossible to kind of penetrate this mindset that prevailed because of what he called, quote, "the constant daily drum fire from our press that they are militarily amusing." The Navy didn't think the Navy didn't think it itself could attack Japan by sailing all that way and with aircraft carriers. And there was a mentality of, if our Navy couldn't do that to them, they couldn't do that to us. It's a tendency you may have heard of called mirror imaging. When you're trying to gauge the other guy's capabilities, it's as if you're looking into a mirror and the reflection you get is you. So if we can't do it, they can't do it. And it made it easier to take a report like Patrick Bellinger's and sort of say, well, okay, he thought about that. It might happen, but it's unlikely it'll happen. He may have covered the bases for us, and we've ticked that box, but even though Bellinger had laid out this scenario, it wasn't probable. In the same vein, there was also a belief that they had, there was an attribute of Pearl Harbor that worked in their favor when it came to defending the island and defending the fleet. And that attribute was the depth of the harbor. When you drop a torpedo from an airplane, they're very heavy things, and they plunge quite deeply into the water. And if there isn't enough water, they simply go into the bottom. Our own torpedoes needed considerably more depth than was available in Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was about 45 feet. And so our own torpedoes couldn't work in 45 feet of water, and we had concluded that it was, therefore, the ships in the harbor were safe from aerial attack and didn't need to have nets strung around them that might catch torpedoes. It never seems to have occurred to anyone that the Japanese, who also knew the depth of Pearl Harbor, rather than simply accepting that as a reality of life, would seek to solve the problem. Again, we didn't think much of their mechanical and technological ability, but they did solve the problem. By altering the fins, or adding fins to two torpedoes, they reduced the depth by which they made it possible to work in 45 feet of water. And I would note as an aside, the damage at Pearl Harbor that was the most destructive was caused by the initial launching of Japanese torpedoes. The torpedoes did the most damage, the ones that we didn't think could work there. So to recap, everyone knew war was likely, It was well known that an attack before a war was declared in a surprise way was possible at Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese weren't very good. Which brings me to the final point I'd like to make of the four, and the final person I'd like you to meet. And it's about the Japanese. I'd like to share with you the story of a young man named Sadao Chigusa. On November 30th, again, 75 years ago today, he was aboard one of those 30 warships that were plowing silently across the North Pacific on their way to Hawaii, which, by the way, was 3,150 miles from the point at which they set out. It wasn't until a few days before they left that Chigusa not only found out who the enemy was, which he hadn't known, but where they were going. They kept that secret from the roughly 16,000 men aboard those 30 warships until the very last minute. It's really remarkable in retrospect how much debate there was within the Imperial Navy about conducting this attack. On that same day, Japan intended to attack all those places I mentioned earlier. Those reports of warships moving towards the Southwest Pacific were correct, and they did attack those places. But that really was the main effort for Japan that day. That was its main goal, not attacking the Pacific Fleet. And many of the admirals and officers within the Imperial Navy didn't want to attack the Pacific Fleet. They felt if the Americans challenge us after we do all these other things, let them sail towards us. Let's not sail towards them. Let them be far from home, not us. But the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Navy, a man whose name was Isiroko Yamamoto, insisted that the way to win the war, or at least have a chance to win the war, was to eliminate the only threat to the Imperial Navy that existed in the Pacific, and that was the Pacific Fleet. And to do it before the war started in total surprise, hoping to destroy American morale. The objections to that idea, though, were this. How was it possible to keep secret the movement of 30 warships across the Pacific on a mission that would take 12 days? They could be seen at any moment by a commercial ship, an American warship, an American plane. And the worst part of that is that if they were spotted, they might not know it. Why is that significant? Well, if the Americans spotted them, but the Japanese didn't know they had been spotted, they might continue sailing directly into an ambush that the Americans had prepared for them, rather than the other way around. And the final objection, or a objection, I should say, to the attack was there was no guarantee the Pacific Fleet was going to be there when they got there. Again, it's the age before satellites. When they set out on November 26th, they had no way of knowing yet whether their target would even be there. They could show up, the fleet might be missing, and then it would be the Japanese wondering, well, where are they, and are we now at risk? So when Chigusa found out, oh, you're going to Hawaii to surprise the Americans, he thought that was the end of his life. And he was not alone among those men. They thought this was a mission that would result in mass death. He said he would die, quote, off Hawaii in the greatest and most desperate battle in our history. He cut a snippet of his hair, and he stuck it in an envelope and sent it to his wife and his children as mementos of him, because he thought he would never see them again. He sent a letter to his parents bidding them farewell. Sadly, his parents lived in Hiroshima, and we know what happened 4 years later to Hiroshima. The men aboard his ship had a joke. They were all going to receive Japan's highest military honor, but none of them would be there for the ceremony. It would be awarded posthumously. So when they arrived off Hawaii on December 7th, in the early morning darkness, they were almost as surprised as the Americans were about to be that they had not been found. They had seen no one had seen them. They had encountered no ships, no airplanes, no one had been searching for them. And so Chigusa wrote in his diary that it was, in effect, a miracle. I really couldn't find any other better expression of our good fortune than the words, the grace of heaven and the help of God. They had succeeded because they had been underestimated. And they had succeeded because along the way, the Americans had written badly phrased messages to each other, trying to communicate the warnings. Reports of intelligence reports were, I wouldn't say ignored, but the best possible spin was put on some of them. And the result is what you know. In closing, I'd like to share the moment when all of those problems, when the assumptions that they had made, the Americans had made, were being eviscerated, and when it became apparent that the Japanese had pulled off this thing that the Americans had thought they couldn't do. It was a moment late on December 7th. It might have been, I think it was even after midnight, and it was now December 8th, here in Washington at the old Navy Department, which no longer exists, of course. And a man placed a telephone call. The man was named Harold R. Stark. Harold was the chief of naval operations, the highest ranking uniformed officer in the Navy. And it was very hard to get information about what had happened at Pearl Harbor during the day. Again, this isn't the age of television that was beaming live reports from the side of the harbor. Even the government was having trouble understanding the extent of the damage. And so Harold Stark called Pearl Harbor, and he finally got through, and he reached an admiral named Claude Bloch, B-L-O-C-H. And Stark did have in his hands, in his possession, the first official report that had been cabled from Oahu and Pearl, sent by Admiral Kimmel. And I'll briefly tell you what Kimmel said. He sent this late on December 7th, Hawaiian time. And it's sort of in military speak, so bear with. He said, surprise attack by Japanese damaged all battleships except Maryland. He said the Arizona was a total wreck. He said the cruisers Honolulu, Helena, and Raleigh were, quote, unfit for sea. The destroyers Shaw, Cassin, and Downs were a complete loss. But he said, personnel behaving magnificently in face of furious surprise. I don't know if you caught it, but twice in that note, Kimmel referred to surprise, as if he needed Washington to understand this wasn't incompetence, it was treachery. So Stark had that information, but he wanted more. And so he called and reached Admiral Bloch. Now, all this time, since the warning he had sent out, Stark had been under the assumption that the Pacific Fleet had gone to sort of defensive measures and was searching to make sure it wasn't being approached in the islands by the Japanese. And here's what he said to Bloch. Did our patrol planes get them before they hit us? Stark had always assumed they were out, looking. He had never asked if they were. He was realizing they had not been. No, Bloch said, and he began to ramble about another topic. But Stark wasn't going to let this topic go. He asked again, can you tell me how many and how far out the search planes were scouting? No, I cannot, said Bloch. Do you know how many were out? No, I don't. What sectors they were in? No, I don't. Kimmel knows that. Well, tell Kimmel I will be asking him these questions, that I want to know how far out they were and in what sectors. Actually, Bloch had a pretty good idea about the patrol planes because he finally confessed to Stark, the answers will be sad, very unsatisfactory. They caught us flat-footed. So, there you go. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, and I've been asked to ask you to go to the microphones if you have them.
While we're waiting, did Helen survive the war?
She did. And a part I didn't tell you is she was husband Kimmel's niece. He had multiple brothers, and one of the things she was very proud of was to come to Hawaii to see him. Yes.
So thank you for an excellent talk. That was
Thank
really
you.
interesting. There was a lot of concern about Japanese espionage from Hawaii back to Japan. Was there, in fact, any confirmation from Hawaii to the fleet or to Japan that the fleet was still in the harbor?
Yes. While they didn't know that when they left, they found that out as they were on their way. Japan's primary spy in Hawaii was kind of a ne'er-do-well named Takao Yoshikama. He was frequently drunk and wasn't particularly well liked at the Japanese embassy because he didn't seem to do anything. They were unaware that his real job was to be a spy. It's very, very easy to spy on the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. If you've been there, it doesn't take much at all to go up into the residential neighborhood that's just above the harbor, turn around and look down, and you can see the whole harbor, which is today still an active naval base. You can stand there and count ships, which is what Yoshikawa did. He knew enough about ship types and even the names of American warships that he could identify them. He wouldn't take notes, wouldn't write anything down because he feared he would be stopped by the FBI, which he never was. But he would go back and radio to Tokyo which ships had left the harbor, which ships had come in. And he did this for weeks. But as the date for the attack approached, and he didn't know the date, although he suspected that something was going to happen, they asked for that he increase the frequency of his reports. And in fact, the last one he sent on December 6th to Tokyo, which was then relayed to the Japanese fleet, which I should say, that fleet was never using its radios. It was not talking, but it was receiving. And so they did learn that the fleet was going, the Pacific Fleet, or most of it, it was there. And so on that last day of December 6th, Yoshikawa gave a report on the number of battleships, destroyers, and so on. And he also noted that there appeared to be no air reconnaissance being flown from the island, which was true. And he noted this would seem to be a good opportunity for surprise. And he didn't know what was about to happen, but he was right. Yes?
A couple of things. Number one, how did it happen that the carriers were all gone, and did the spies report note the absence of the carriers? Number two, one of the most famous images that come out of Pearl Harbor was the explosion of the Arizona. How did it happen that a camera happened to be, a film camera, happened to be trained on the Arizona at precisely that moment it blew up?
Boy, the short answer is I don't know, but you're right, it's one of the amazing photos. One of the things I was unable to pin down, not that perhaps you care that much, but so Kimmel was at his house overlooking the harbor when the attack began, And his driver immediately pulled up. He had a car and a driver, and no one had summoned his driver. The driver just seems to have known intuitively that he was going to have to go get the admiral and take him to fleet headquarters, which was alongside the harbor. And I was never able to pin down whether the admiral was in his car at the moment the Arizona blew up, had already reached fleet headquarters. I would bet that he heard it, wherever he was. And it really was a stunning moment. The single greatest cause of death on December 7th was the blowing up of the Arizona, which I guess you'd have to say it's kind of a lucky shot. A bomb dropped into the forward magazine of the ship, and it simply erupted. It was, I'm sure, a horrific sound. I don't know why someone happened to be shooting that at that time. Now, your other question was about the aircraft carriers, and I'll try not to be too military. Aircraft carriers were relatively new in the annals of warfare. They had not been used in World War I. They really hadn't existed. And so navies were slowly exploring the potential of aircraft carriers. And to be honest, the Japanese got there first, as often happens with technology. They realized the extremely potent kind of attacks that massed airplanes could deliver if brought by sea. The one thing Bellinger didn't quite get in his otherwise prescient forecast, he said one or more carriers might approach Hawaii. Well, in fact, they used 6. And no fleet had ever put that many together. It was so incomprehensible, even after it occurred, that the Japanese had used so many, that messages from Pearl Harbor to Washington were saying, we are hunting for the 2 aircraft carriers. They couldn't mentally get around the idea that there were way more than that. There were 3 times that many. The United States had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Ocean in 1941, and it was simple luck that they were not there. One was on the West Coast in San Diego. The 2 others happened to be at sea and escaped the attack, which actually changed the course of history. One of those 2 aircraft carriers was the Enterprise. And 6 months later, the Enterprise was one of the aircraft carriers that turned the table on the Japanese at the Battle of Midway, and pretty much, I think, changed the course of the war. The American aircraft carriers sank 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. So it was kind of revenge. But it was the luck of not being there on December 7th really altered the course of the war. So it just happenstance, and the Japanese were quite disappointed that they were not there, and the spy had told Tokyo that they weren't there. They were as anxious to hit the aircraft carriers as they were the battleships. So I hope that answers your question. Yes, sir.
Hey, Steve.
Oh, damn.
How are you?
This better be a softball. I know.
I was wondering if you could talk about your creative process for a minute and how you approach this as a writer, because a lot of the facts were known, right? So,
Yes.
and for you to tell a story new, and you mentioned earlier, it was almost like a thriller. So as you're doing your research and then compiling your information to write, I'm just really curious about your own personal creative process, knowing that you're going to tell the story a certain way.
Well, the assumption behind that question is that there was a creative process. It really was. I wasn't kidding. It was a strange experience to try to write about events in which I could not call up and ask people about them. Fortunately, Pearl Harbor is among the most officially investigated events in American history. within 5 years after the attack, there were 9 investigations from small, meaning one person, up to the last, which was a formal congressional investigation. The fact there were so many tells you, I think, to a degree, just how shocking this event was. People had to come to grips with what had happened. The good thing about being investigated like that is that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages of testimony, and the congressional investigation I mentioned resulted in 40 volumes. So the creative process consisted of reading and frequently yelling at the pages because some senator or congressman had not asked the kind of question I wanted asked. And what kind of questions were those? Well, I really wanted to know how people felt and what they, not so much their decisions in a military sense, but what this was doing in an emotional and personal sense. I thought the way to tell this story, which had been so often told, is to tell it as if you, the reader, don't know the outcome and you're coming along with them because they don't know the outcome. Yet each day, things are taking place that were adding to the suspense. And in addition to the congressional or all these investigations, many of the officers participated in oral histories, and you get a real sense of someone's personality if you read enough of the Q&As with them. One of the great difficulties in the book, or in doing the book, this originally started out as a biography of Admiral Husband Kimmel, which no one had ever written. And I thought, here's one of the great figures of American history, absolutely unknown to most people. Boy, and it was, I'm brilliant. No one's thought of doing a biography about him. Well, I quickly decided there was a reason nobody had done a biography about him, in that he was a very not reflective individual. He didn't keep a diary. He rarely, if ever, wrote letters. He never participated, to my knowledge, in an oral history. And while he was questioned a lot in those investigations, again, people weren't asking emotional questions. And I'll give you an example. Kimmel's papers are at the University of Wyoming. When you think Navy, you think Wyoming, right? But when we say his papers, they're mostly official stuff. There are letters in there from when he was first in the Navy, writing to his mother. And to give you an idea of what kind of guy he was, he would give vivid descriptions to his mother of the elevations and gauges of big guns. Like, that's what you want to hear from your son at sea, right? Well, thank God the elevation of that turret was what it was. And then the letters in his papers stop about 1915. There are only a couple after that. And there were no letters to his wife. And I was, dying to find a letter in September of 1941. I had these fantasies that you would find a letter that said, "Dear Dot," her name was Dorothy, "Dear Dot, boy, I really don't know what I'm doing out here. Something, that would be slap your forehead, wow, this is great stuff, or I'm scared to death of the Japanese, or I know I should be sending up planes to search for them, but He never did that. I could never find those letters because I've always wondered about that. But so it was, to go back to your question, very hard to try to have no pity for me. It was very hard to recreate scenes and people like I used to do when I was a journalist. You look for, I thought people wanted to, a good part of the book is trying to explain what Hawaii was like in 1941, how we thought of the Japanese, and things like that. And actually, those were easier to find, but that's a long answer to your question, and my wife always says I answer questions too long, so.
We have time for one more.
Okay, hopefully quick questions. One is on the carrier question. I've seen credit given to Halsey. I think it was Halsey, or perhaps it was Nimitz. I don't remember. But the officer in charge of the carriers for being more vigilant, more concerned about the threat, more active, and than the lack of patrol planes would suggest where it was going on in other quarters. So, I mean, from that perspective, it might have been more than luck. It might have been a more energetic or concerned, understanding approach. The other question is on the film. You mentioned the Ben Affleck film, but you know, an older film that's sort of more of a standard.
It's a good one.
Would be Tora, Tora, Tora.
That's a
and just you know, sort of a brief comment on, you know, how accurate in general was Tora, Tora, Tora.
I think
in terms of
Tora,
its
Tora,
coverage?
Tora, which I think came out in 1980, 1981, is actually pretty accurate. I think, you know, for Hollywood purposes, things get condensed and simplified, but it's pretty good. And I thought that book, that movie is based on a book some of you may know. It's called At Dawn We Slept, by a professor at the University of Maryland, now deceased, named Gordon Prang. Gordon was in the Army, I think it was the Army, in 1945, and his job in the service after the surrender of the Japanese was to go around and interview Japanese officers about the war, and he really opened the door to understanding the Japanese side of the attack, and that subsequent book became the basis for the movie, and that's why there's such a large component in the movie of the Japanese side. And he donated all of his papers to the University of Maryland, including his notes of the interviews with all of these officers, and that was a big help to me, because I'm more interested in the characters, I think, and he's more interested in the tactics. So there were things that weren't used in those notes that were really helpful to me in the book. And you had another question. Oh, Halsey. About Halsey.
Halsey or Nimitz, whatever admiral was in charge of the carrier.
It was William Halsey, a character in his own right. He wasn't yet Bull Halsey in 1941. He became Bull Halsey in the course of the war. I don't know why he was called Bull Halsey, but we can all use our imaginations. He was on his way to the island of Wake. That's why his carrier wasn't there. He was ferrying Marine fighter planes to Wake Island on the deck of his carrier. So it wasn't that he was more aware or attuned to the threat. He was actually, at that point, being FedEx. Wake Island was an American outpost defended by Marines, and they wanted additional airplanes there, and the only way to get them, because it was too far to fly, was to put them on an aircraft carrier and take them, and that's what he was doing. However, he was aware in this sense. He knew about this warning of war, which had been delivered the day before he was to leave, the warning from Washington. And he asked Kimmel, well, what do I do if I encounter the Japanese between here and Wake Island? Wake is 2,000 miles from Hawaii. And Kimmel turned to him and said, they were close friends. They had been in the same class at the Naval Academy. And Kimmel said, Bill, use your common sense. And Halsey thought that was just the most terrific order he could ever be given, because to him, common sense means shoot first. And as soon as his aircraft carrier sailed out of Pearl Harbor on the morning of November 28th, bound for Wake Island, he put bombs on all of his planes, loaded all of his anti-aircraft guns, and a message to his crew was issued saying it was identified as Battle Order Number 1. In other words, the first order of a war that we weren't in yet. That's how much they thought something might happen. And he told his crew, we're about to be on the, we are on the verge of war, and this country demands that you be aggressive and fight. So Halsey expected that between Pearl Harbor and Wake Island over the next week, it would take a week to get there, they could well be attacked, or he would see the Japanese an attack first. That's how common the idea that we were going to be at war was. And you could ask, well, how come that didn't translate to Pearl Harbor? Both Halsey and Kimmel were asked, well, okay, if you thought Halsey was going to be attacked on the way to this island, what about Pearl? And Kimmel said, oh, well, Wake is 2,000 miles away. In other words, the Japanese wouldn't come this far. I always wanted to know, Admiral, where did you think the line was that they would come this far and no farther? Yes, Halsey is the subject of several books, and probably he's a character. So, I'm sorry.